Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about an enslaved woman named Dinah Carter and the night she turned a firewood axe into an instrument of terrible justice that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. In the deep, suffocating memory of the American South, there are nights that refuse to be forgotten. They persist, not within the sanitized, ink and paper confines of history books, but in the very marrow of the land itself, in the chilling whispers that travel on the humid air when the moon is a scar in the sky. One of those nights, a night that tore a hole in the fabric of time, belongs to Christmas Eve, 1854. In a corner of Louisiana, a place where the world felt ancient and God seemed to have turned his eyes away, a different kind of nativity was unfolding. There was no serene manger, no guiding star, no hushed reverence. There was only the coppery, metallic scent of fresh blood mixing with the festive aroma of pine and roasting meats, a grotesque parody of holiday cheer. And there was the glow, an unholy, ravenous glow of a great house burning against the black canvas of the sky. Its flames a terrible and righteous hymn that consumed wood, flesh, and the lie of a civilized world. This was the night the Carter plantation was erased from the earth. Its end did not come from a rival planter's greed, nor from the chaos of a bandit raid. It was meticulously and intimately undone from within, in the span of a few dark hours, as the rest of the Christian world celebrated a Savior's birth. Master Jeremiah Carter and his 4 sons, the proud inheritors of a cruel and prosperous dynasty, were systematically slaughtered. Their bodies left as a brutal testament in the collapsing, flame-gutted mansion. The architect of this massacre was not an army, not a band of abolitionist rebels. It was a single, silent woman whose name was a ghost on the lips of those who knew her, Dinah Carter, an enslaved field hand and laundress. Her existence had been so thoroughly erased from the plantation's daily ledger of consequence that she was, for all intents and purposes, a phantom moving through the world of the living. With a common firewood axe, a tool she would have used countless times to chop wood for the very fires that warmed her enslavers, she carved an end to their world and a beginning to a legend. When the final great rafter of the main house groaned, splintered, and fell into the inferno, sending a showers of embers towards the heavens, she did not flee alone into the night. Behind her, a silent procession of 247 souls, men, women, and children once listed as property alongside cattle and cotton bales, walked barefoot out of bondage. They moved with a stunned, terrified reverence, following the woman who had traded her lifelong silence for their collective freedom. Stepping into the unwelcoming reptilian darkness of the swamp, the question that hangs over that night, a question that chills the blood more than any ghost story, is not simply what happened. It is the far more terrifying question of why. How is a human soul pushed so far into the abyss of suffering that it returns not broken, but remade, wielding the very fire of damnation to understand the axe and the hand that swung it? We must first understand the world that forged them both. The Carter plantation was a self-contained kingdom built on 2 pillars, the sweet poison of sugarcane and the bottomless well of human misery. It was nestled, or more accurately, trapped, 34 miles from the relative civilization of Baton Rouge, held in the festering, humid embrace of the Louisiana cypress swamp. This was not merely a location, it was a character in the tragedy, an active participant in the horrors it witnessed. The land itself felt complicit, ancient and weary. The gnarled cypress trees, some centuries old, were draped in funereal Spanish moss that swayed in the windless air. Leaning over the murky, black water like old mourners who had long ago run out of tears. The atmosphere was a physical weight. The air, so thick with humidity it felt like breathing through a wet cloth. Muffled sound, swallowing the sharp crack of the overseer's whip and the desperate prayers from the slave quarters with equal, suffocating indifference. Travelers' journals from the era, rare as they were, described the region as a place where the veil between the world of the living and the realm of the dead feels perilously thin. A land that seemed to sweat with the perpetual fever of sorrow and primordial dread. Rising from this landscape of elegant decay was the big house, a stark white mansion of Palladian design perched on a low hill. To the Carters and their infrequent guests, it was a beacon of civilization, a testament to their divinely ordained prosperity, to the hundreds of enslaved people who toiled under its gaze. It was the ever-watchful eye of a malevolent, unsleeping god. Its windows, dark during the day and glowing with candlelight at night, were like vacant sockets staring down upon them in the fields, in the cabins, in their most private moments of grief or fleeting joy. The house was a constant, silent reminder of their absolute powerlessness. It watched their births, it watched their labors, and it watched their unceremonious deaths, their bodies often committed to unmarked graves at the edge of the cane fields. This social and geographical isolation was absolute, creating a closed system where the Carters were kings, judges, and executioners. The law was a distant abstraction, an inconvenience easily bent by wealth and influence. The church, too, offered no solace. Its sermons often twisted scripture to justify the institution of slavery as a natural. Holy order. The entire society of planters was woven into a single, impenetrable fabric of mutual interest and shared guilt. Parish records, the only official accounting of these lives, speak of souls in the cold, hard language of inventory, assets, stock, property, with notes on their physical condition as one might describe livestock. In such a world, justice was not a universal principle. It was a commodity, owned and defined exclusively by the masters. And beneath the fragile veneer of southern gentility, beneath the scent of night-blooming jasmine and the clinking of fine crystal brandy glasses, lay a foundation of unspoken, systemic violence. It was a secret everyone knew, but no one spoke. A rot that the earth itself was struggling to contain. The soil, overworked and depleted, had accepted so many broken bodies, so many stillborn babies, so many victims of fever or accident, that it was said a man could no longer tell the difference between sugarcane roots and human skeletons. And in the very heart of this suffocating, predatory world moved a shadow. Her name was Dinah. She had existed on the Carter plantation for all of her 28 years, and in that time, she had mastered at its most essential and tragic survival skill, utter invisibility. She was a woman who did not speak. The origins of her silence were a piece of plantation folklore, a mystery whispered behind cupped hands in the dark of the cabins. Some of the elders, their memories stretching back decades, claimed she was born that way, a child of God marked by a holy silence from her first breath. But others, their voices dropping low, told a darker, more plausible story. They said her voice had been stolen from her throat on the night. As a girl of 5, she watched her own mother be dragged from their cabin to the big house. Her mother returned at dawn, a hollowed-out vessel, a woman with a broken body and eyes that no longer recognized her own child. From that day forward, the story went, not a single word had ever passed Dinah's lips. But her silence was not emptiness. It was a vessel, a vast and meticulously organized archive, while her hands, raw and chapped, scrubbed blood from sheets that were not her own, emptied chamber pots that reeked of gin and moral decay, and polished the unblinking glass eyes of porcelain dolls that wore silk while real children wore burlap and scars. Her mind was a fortress. It was a library of every sin committed on that land. Because when you do not speak, people forget that you can hear. They forget that you can see. They forget that you can remember. She heard the mistress's stifled, impotent sobs at night, prayers whispered to a God who never seemed to answer. She heard Master Carter refer to her, and others like her, as it, as if they were tools or animals, most chillingly. She heard the soft rustle of expensive skirts and the deliberate creak of floorboards when one of the Carter sons, most often the eldest and crudest, Thomas, would slip out of the main house and into the quarters, seeking out girls too young to bleed. Every sound, every suppressed whimper, every casual act of cruelty, every stolen life, it was all collected, categorized, and stored away in the vast, silent vault of her memory. She was a living record, a silent chronicler of a history no one would ever write down. And she was not alone in her quiet endurance. Around her moved others who carried their own burdens in their own way. There was Jonas, the blacksmith, a man of immense physical power, whose arms could bend iron to his will, yet who was forced to spend his days forging the very chains and collars that bound his people. His contained rage was in the percussive clang of his hammer on the anvil, a sound that was both creation and destruction. There was Ada, the old midwife, whose hands were maps of sorrow and resilience. They had welcomed over 200 children into this world and, with the same gentle care, had wrapped nearly half of them in burial shrouds before they saw their 10th year. Her wisdom was not in words, but in a deep, weary understanding of the cycles of life and death in this broken place. And there was Mungo, the field hand with a back like a lattice work of scars and eyes that seemed to look past the physical world. He would stand at the edge of the swamp at dusk, claiming he could hear the ancestors speaking on the wind, reading messages in the flight of crows. They were all quiet in their own way, each bearing a different, soul-crushing weight. But in Dinah, the silence was different. It was deeper, more absolute. It was a stillness that felt less like peace and more like the coiled tension of a spring, being tightened, turn by painful, unforgivable turn, waiting for the one final twist that would cause it to violently, irrevocably, and righteously snap. For years, the spring coiled tighter within Dinah, a potential energy of pure, undifferentiated rage stored against a debt of countless injustices. But then, in the 7th year of her arranged marriage to a field hand named Joseph, a quiet, sturdy man, whose kindness was a rare and fragile commodity, an event occurred that gave that coiled fury both a center and a terrible new vulnerability. It was an event that defied the plantation's sterile calculus of assets and losses, a miracle of flesh and blood that defied a world determined to crush it. Dinah became a mother. The pregnancy was her first act of true rebellion, a secret kept between her, her own resilient body, and the silent, watchful earth, in a place where the wombs of the enslaved were considered property of the master, used to breed the next generation of laborers. Dinah's pregnancy went entirely unnoticed. She moved through her grueling chores with a new, fierce purpose, her silence now a protective shield for the life growing within. The usual signs of her condition were masked by the loose burlap of her clothing and the perpetual exhaustion that was the uniform of her existence. When the time came, it was not in a sterile infirmary, but in the deep of night in her cabin, with only the midwife Ida as a witness. It was there, in the flickering candlelight, that Dinah's silence was finally broken not by words, but by the raw, primal sounds of labor, the grunts of pain and effort that are the universal language of creation. And then, a different sound, the thin, piercing cry of a newborn. Ida, her ancient hands as steady as the roots of a cypress tree, cleaned the child and placed her in Dinah's arms. In that moment, looking down at the small, perfect face, Dinah felt a shift in the very architecture of her soul. The vast, cold archive of memory and pain within her suddenly had a focal point. It now had a reason to fight, a reason to fear in a way she had never feared for herself. She named the child Tamar. It was a name heavy with history. Drawn from the old scriptures, Ida would sometimes whisper stories from the story of a king's daughter who was wronged, shamed, and cast aside, whose cries for justice went unanswered by the world of men. It was a name that was both a prayer and a prophecy. From that day forward, Dinah's silence transformed. It was no longer the passive shield of an observer. It became the active, watchful silence of a guardian. Tamar became the quiet center of her universe, while other children learned to shout and play. Tamar learned the art of quiet joy. She never cried loudly, as if she understood instinctively that noise brought trouble from the big house. Instead, she would hum, low and sweet like the buzzing of a honeybee, a secret melody that only Dinah could truly hear. The most precious moments of Dinah's existence were spent behind the washhouse, away from prying eyes, where she would braid her daughter's hair, her calloused fingers surprisingly gentle, weaving strands of hair as if weaving a spell of protection. At night, in the suffocating confines of their small cabin, Dinah would lie awake for hours, her hand resting lightly on Tamar's tiny chest, just to feel the steady, rhythmic thump of her heart, a small, persistent drumbeat of life against the overwhelming silence of death that surrounded them. It was a confirmation that the world had not yet stolen her. Not yet. But the world was greedy, and its masters were patient predators. As the years passed, Tamar grew from a babe in arms to a girl of 7. She possessed a delicate beauty and a spirit that, despite the oppressive atmosphere, had not been entirely extinguished. She was a wildflower blooming in a barren field, and her vibrancy began to attract the wrong kind of attention. The pressure began not as a storm, but as a subtle shift in the air, a change in the way the shadows fell. It began with the gaze of Thomas Carter. He was the eldest of the Carter sons, a man whose arrogance was matched only by his cruelty. He had his father's entitlement, but lacked his father's thin veneer of civility. His pleasures were simple and depraved the fear in a slave's eyes, the crack of a whip, and the breaking of things that were not his to break. At first, it was just a lingering look. Thomas would rein in his horse by the fields where Tamar might be playing with other children, his eyes passing over them and settling on her for a moment too long. Dinah, working nearby, would feel his gaze like a physical touch, a cold slick of oil on her skin, and her blood would turn to ice. She began to keep Tamar closer, inventing tasks for her near the washhouse, trying to shrink her world into a safe, observable space. But the plantation was not a place where one could hide. The pressure escalated. One afternoon, Thomas dismounted and approached a group of children, a false, predatory smile on his face. He held out a piece of hard candy, offering it directly to Tamar. The other children looked on with a mixture of fear and envy. Tamar, remembering her mother's silent warnings conveyed through a simple tightening of the hand, shook her head and backed away, hiding behind an older girl. Thomas's smile faltered for a second, replaced by a flash of irritation. He tossed the candy into the dirt and walked away. But the message had been sent. He had marked her as an object of his attention. He had demonstrated that he could approach her whenever he pleased. The psychological torment intensified. Dinah became a creature of pure, vigilant dread. Sleep offered no respite, as her dreams were filled with faceless horrors and the sound of her daughter crying out. Her every waking moment was consumed by a crippling hyper-awareness of Thomas's location, his moods, his patterns, the breaking point, the moment that confirmed her worst fears. Came one evening when she was tasked with collecting laundry from the back porch of the big house. Through the open parlor window, she heard the laughter of Thomas and his younger brother, Charles. She heard the clink of glasses, and then she heard her daughter's name. "That little mute one's girl is sprouting up nicely," Thomas slurred, his voice thick with brandy. "Reminds me of her mother, back before she got so quiet. Maybe the girl has a voice. I think I could find it." The casual, possessive cruelty of his words struck Dinah with the force of a physical blow. She froze. In the shadows, her knuckles white as she gripped the laundry basket. This was not a passing whim. It was a stated intention. It was a promise. From that moment, she knew it was no longer a question of if, but of when. The snap came on a sweltering afternoon in late summer, when the air was so thick and still it felt like the world was holding its breath. Dinah was at the Livats, a grueling, caustic job that stained her hands and filled her lungs with acrid smoke. Tamar was playing near the old sugar press, a place of imagined games amongst the giant gears and discarded machine parts, a mechanical graveyard that children often found fascinating. Dinah could just see the top of her head from where she worked. She had told her not to wander. Then, through the shimmering heat haze, she saw Thomas Carter walking from the stables, a bottle in his hand, heading toward the press. A cold, sharp blade of panic pierced Dinah's heart. She tried to call out, but no sound came. She tried to run, but the overseer was watching. All she could do was watch, her body locked in a paralysis of terror. The narrative of what happened next does not exist in words, for there was no one to record it, but the silent, indifferent machinery. What exists is the aftermath, a series of fractured, nightmarish moments. There was a sound, a single, sharp cry, a child's scream of pain and terror that was cut off with sickening finality. And then, a silence, a deep, profound silence that was more horrifying than any noise. It was the sound of a life being extinguished. Dinah's world shattered. She dropped everything and ran. The overseer's shouts a distant, meaningless buzz. She ran towards the sugar press, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She called Tamar's name in her mind, a desperate, silent scream. She found her curled beneath the broken axle of a discarded cart, as if trying to hide. Her simple cotton dress was torn, smeared with dirt and a terrifying dark stain. Her body was a fragile collection of wrong angles. She was still breathing, but only just. Dinah gathered her daughter into her arms, the small body weighing nothing and everything at once. Tamar's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and clouded with pain. She looked at her mother and whispered, her voice a barely audible rasp, the last words she would ever speak. "Mama," she breathed. I tried. Then, a final, shuddering sigh, and she was gone. The great, cataclysmic secret was now revealed in the most brutal way imaginable. The carefully constructed reality of the plantation, with its rules and hierarchies, was exposed for what it was, a lawless state of absolute power where the life of a child was worth less than a cask of whiskey. The response from the masters was a masterpiece of casual dehumanization. The overseer, arriving moments later, looked down at the scene, his face a mask of annoyance at the disruption. He declared it a tragic accident. Master Carter, when informed, performed a sigh of theatrical sadness and called it a terrible tragedy. His primary concern being the loss of a future laborer. The mistress, in a gesture of what she likely considered profound piety, sent for a Bible to be read over the body. And Thomas Carter, the architect of this horror, was seen the very next morning, whistling a cheerful hymn as he rode out with his friends for a day of hunting. Dinah did not weep. She did not scream. The part of her capable of such things had died with her daughter. She carried Tama's body back to the quarters and washed her with a tenderness that was terrifying in its precision. She buried her under the old pecan tree at the edge of the woods, the one whose roots curled like gnarled fingers reaching for the dead. She marked the grave with a single, smooth stone. And then, for 3 days and 3 nights, she did not move. She sat by the grave, her body rigid, her eyes open, but seeing nothing of the world around her. She didn't eat. She didn't sleep. The other slaves, knowing a grief too profound to be touched by words, left food and water for her. But it all remained untouched. It was not a vigil of mourning. It was a metamorphosis. On the morning of the 4th day, as the sun rose on a world that had not changed, Dinah stood up. The person who rose was not the same one who had sat down. The old Dinah, the silent victim. The grieving mother was dead and buried with her child. This new being moved with a cold, terrifying purpose. She walked to the communal wash basin and methodically washed her hands and face. Then she turned and walked, not to the fields, not to the laundry, but directly to the wood-cutting shed. She pushed open the door, and her eyes, now as hard and empty as river stones, scanned the tools hanging on the wall. They settled on the wood-cutting axe. She lifted it down from its peg, testing its weight, its balance. The spring, coiled for a lifetime, had finally, irrevocably, snapped. The woman who walked out of the woodshed was not the woman who had entered. The grief, a living entity that had consumed her for 3 days, was gone, or rather, it had been burned away, leaving behind a hard, dense core of crystalline purpose. The world, which had been a muted grey landscape of suffering, was now rendered in stark, clarifying black and white. There were the guilty, and there were the innocent. There was the debt, and there was the payment. The axe in her hand was no longer a simple tool of wood and steel. It was a physical extension of this new reality. It was an artifact of her transformation, and in the weeks to come, it would become the only form of evidence the world of the Carter plantation would understand. Her silence, once a shield of passive endurance, now became a weapon of psychological warfare. It was no longer the silence of fear. It was the chilling stillness of a coiled predator. The profound quiet that precedes a hurricane. The absolute hush before a match touches oil. She began to move through her daily chores with an eerie, almost supernatural precision. The floors she scrubbed were cleaner. The laundry she washed was whiter. But there was an unnerving deliberation to her movements. People began to step aside when she passed. The other slaves, who knew the story of Tama, looked at her not with pity, but with a kind of awe-laced terror. They saw no tears in her eyes, no tremor in her hands. What they saw was a void, an emptiness so complete it seemed to pull the warmth from the air around her. Even the overseer, a man who dealt in casual brutality, found himself avoiding her gaze, unsettled by the unnerving stillness of a creature that no longer seemed to feel the lash. either literally or metaphorically. The most compelling, irrefutable evidence of a change was the axe itself. It never left her side. Each night, long after the others had collapsed into the thin comfort of sleep, Dinah would sit outside her cabin and tend to the weapon. She sharpened the blade on a whetstone taken from the smithy. The rhythmic shing shing shing, a horrifying lullaby in the darkness. She cleaned it with vinegar until the steel gleamed in the moonlight, then oiled it with lard, not for preservation, but as a form of anointment. Historical accounts passed down through oral tradition claim she would whisper to it. Though no one ever heard a word, it was a ritual, a consecration. The axe was becoming a sacred object, a reliquary for every ounce of her pain and rage. It was the physical manifestation of her verdict. This transformation did not go unnoticed by the few who possessed the sight to see past the surface of things. Jonas, the blacksmith, was the first. He watched her from his forge, his own simmering fury recognizing a kindred spirit. He saw how she carried the axe, not as a burden, but as if it were a natural part of her arm, its weight a comfort rather than a strain. One evening, as she passed the forge, Thomas Carter rode by, whistling a hymn, his face smug and untroubled. Dinah did not flinch, did not even seem to register his presence. But Jonas saw the muscles in her jaw tighten, a subtle clenching that spoke volumes. He saw in her the final, terrifying conclusion to the equation of their suffering. That night, he took a heavy iron nail and, with 3 precise strikes of his hammer, carved 3 parallel marks into its head. He left it by the door of her cabin, a silent question, a silent offer of alliance. The next morning, he found half a ripe peach sitting on his anvil. The pact was sealed. The evidence had been presented and accepted. Ada, the midwife, saw it too, but she interpreted it through a different lens. She saw not just a desire for revenge, but an awakening of something older, something she called blood memory. It's what they try to beat out of us, she once whispered to a younger woman. The memory of what we was before the chains. It don't die, it just sleeps. Then it wakes when it's needed most. And Mungo, the field hand who spoke with ancestors, claimed the spirits were now walking with Dinah. You ever seen a body so quiet and so loud at the same time? He said to Jonas. This ain't just vengeance. This woman got spirits walking with her. They didn't need a verbal confession to understand what was coming. Dinah's very being had become the irrefutable proof. A judgment was approaching, and its instrument was being honed to a razor's edge in the Louisiana darkness. The confession, when it came, was not one of guilt, but of shared, sacred purpose. It was not spoken in a courtroom, but whispered in the damp, subterranean dark of an old root cellar, a place hidden beneath the smokehouse where the air smelled of cured salt, damp earth, and long-held secrets. This was their sanctuary, their war room. One night, guided by Mungo to this hidden place, Dinah met with her new allies, Jonas, Ida, and Mungo himself. There were no grand speeches, no calls to arms. There was only a quiet, solemn understanding. This was not a rebellion they were planning. It was a cleansing. It was a surgical excision of a cancer that had festered for too long. Here, in the flickering, uncertain light of a single lard oil lamp, the full, terrifying scope of the plan was finally unveiled. This was not about escape. It was not simply about killing Thomas Carter. It was about erasure. Ida, using a stick to draw in a patch of spilled cornmeal on the dirt floor, mapped out the entire big house from memory, every bedroom, every hallway, every hiding spot, every weak beam. Her knowledge was intimate, born of decades of service and silent observation. Jonas, his voice a low rumble, spoke of the keys. He had already begun forging replicas of the pantry key, the gunroom key, and the back cellar key, working in the dead of night while the forge hissed like a beast in the heat. The sound masked by the chirping of crickets. Mungo spoke of the timing, of the movement of the gods, of the rhythms of the plantation. He spoke of omens, of the coming winter solstice, of the potent symbolism of striking on Christmas Eve, the holiest night of the Christian masters, a night when their arrogance would be at its peak and the god at its lowest. And Dinah, the silent catalyst, was the center of it all. She did not speak, but she listened, her mind a cold, precise instrument, absorbing every detail, memorizing every step of the deadly choreography. She took a charred stick and, beside Ida's cornmeal map, she made 5 distinct marks, not names, just slashes in the dirt. One for Thomas, the defiler, one for Charles, who laughed when young girls cried, one for William, who trained the dogs to hunt runaways, one for Nathaniel, the youngest, whose cruelty was quiet but visible in his cold, watchful eyes, and the final, deepest mark for Jeremiah Carter himself, the patriarch, the source from which all this poison flowed. The others looked at the 5 marks, and the finality of their mission settled upon them. They were not just planning to kill 5 men. They were planning to end a bloodline. They were preparing to tear down an entire world, root and stem. Mungo looked at Dinah, his eyes wide with a kind of spiritual reverence. "Justice is a storm," he whispered, quoting an old saying. "And we are the thunder." Dinah did not nod, but she placed her hand flat on the cool steel head of the axe beside her and looked up at the sliver of night sky visible through a crack in the cellar door. That was answer enough. The legal and societal repercussions of their conspiracy would not be determined by any court of law. They were to be the judge, jury, and executioner. The sentence had been decided in the root cellar. The execution was set for Christmas Eve. In the weeks leading up to the holiday, an almost unbearable tension settled over the plantation. In the big house, it was a time of festive preparation. Mistress Helen, oblivious, directed the decoration of the grand dining hall. White ribbons were hung from the columns. Imported cheeses and honey hams were ordered, and the enslaved children were made to practice singing carols outside, their sweet voices a grotesque counterpoint to the impending doom. For Dinah and her co-conspirators, it was a time of final, meticulous preparation. Jonas hid sharpened iron rods in the ash barrels behind the kitchens. Ida gathered herbs and prepared salves, for she knew not all would walk away unscathed. Mungo spoke in whispers to a select few, the ones who had nothing left to lose, planting the seeds of the mass exodus that would follow the strike. One night, Thomas Carter, swaggering and drunk, cornered Dinah by the stables. "Can't wait for some Christmas sweetness," he muttered, his breath sour with rum. "Might even take that quiet one, break her open." He never saw the look in Dinah's eyes, but if he had, he would have seen hell staring back at him. This was the final confirmation, the final insult upon a mountain of them. On Christmas Eve, the night was unnaturally cold and clear. The gods, given extra rations of whiskey, were slumped in drunken slumber on the porch. The house glowed, a beacon of warmth and arrogance. The path to justice was clear, moving like shadows unchained. The conspirators struck. Jonas dispatched the guards with 2 swift, silent blows of his hammer. The others secured the perimeter, and Dinah, barefoot, her feet making no sound on the cold ground, walked into the house. The axe felt light in her hands, an extension of her own arm. She moved through the opulent rooms like smoke, her heart a loud, steady drum. She went to Thomas's room first. The axe split the door like bone. He sat up in bed, his eyes wide with confusion before the blade took half his jaw. 1. Charles heard the commotion and tried to run. He didn't make it past the hallway. Dinah's second swing caught his spine. 2. William charged with a decorative knife, screaming like a frightened boy. She ducked his clumsy thrust and drove the axe into his stomach. "For Tamar," she whispered, the first words she had spoken in years, her voice a low, gravelly sound like stones grinding together. 3. Nathaniel was found hiding in the pantry, sobbing and clutching a book of Psalms. He begged, swearing his innocence. "You watched," she said, and the axe answered. 4. The last was Jeremiah Carter. He had locked himself in his study. The thick oak door, a final, futile barrier. It took 10 blows, each one an echo of a lash, each one a curse undone. When the door finally splintered and broke, Jeremiah stood with a pistol aimed. He fired. The bullet grazed her shoulder. She didn't even flinch. He fumbled to reload, his hands trembling. It was too slow. Dinah stepped forward and slammed the axe down. Once, twice, 3 times, until the master was gone. 5. The societal repercussion was immediate and absolute, as Mungo and Jonas set fire to the house. Ida was leading 247 men, women, and children into the woods. Their march illuminated by the funeral pyre of their former prison. The social order of the Carter plantation had not been reformed. It had been annihilated. Dinah stood for a moment at the top of the burning steps, her body splattered with the blood of her tormentors. The axe held loosely at her side. She looked out, not at the fire, but at the dark road leading away, at the faces of the people she had freed. Then, before turning to vanish into the woods with them, she spoke one final word into the night, a word that was both a promise and a new beginning. Now! The word now hung in the cold morning air, a promise fulfilled, as the first grey reluctant light of Christmas Day. 1854 crept over the horizon to reveal a world remade by fire and blood. There were no choirs singing, no church bells ringing. There was only the thick, black, and bitter smoke rising over the Carter plantation, carrying the scent of ash, charred privilege, and a final, brutal justice. The reign of the Carters had collapsed into a smoldering ruin, a black skeleton against the winter sky. This was the immediate, physical collapse of a corrupt dynasty, but a more profound redefinition was already taking place in the shadows of the swamp. A redefinition of what it meant to be human in a world that had denied that very status. The 247 souls who had walked away from the flames were no longer slaves, but they were not yet free. They were something new, something dangerous. They were fugitives. Their first hours of liberty were not marked by celebration, but by a primal, silent urgency. This was not an escape. It was a procession, a mobile nation being born in the mud and darkness. Ida, the old midwife, now a matriarch and guide, walked at the front. She did not use a map of paper and ink, but one etched into her memory, a map of old runaway trails, of routes that offered a firm foothold, of stars that whispered direction. Jonas, his blacksmith's hammer, now a weapon slung over his shoulder, guarded the rear, his eyes scanning the darkness, his presence a silent promise of protection. And in the middle, a moving center of gravity, was Dinah. She walked with the axe tucked under her arm, her body a canvas of soot and dried blood, her face an unreadable mask. She gave no orders, but when she stopped, they stopped. When she moved, they followed. She was their compass, their silent, terrifying patron saint. Back at the plantation, the new reality dawned with the arrival of Overseer Briggs, returning from a 3-day holiday binge. He rode in to find not a bustling estate, but a scene of apocalyptic silence. The grand piano was a blackened harp with no strings. The dining table was a bed of cinders. He found what was left of the Carter sons, their bodies already being claimed by the elements, and gagged at the sight of Jeremiah in his study. But the most chilling discovery was not the bodies. It was the three words he found carved into the scorched wall above the fireplace. A message left for the world. We remember everything. When the neighbors and the local lawmen arrived, their shock quickly curdled into a cold, existential fear. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't a random act of violence. As they stared at the empty, silent slave quarters, the truth settled upon them. This was a reckoning. The foundation of their world had cracked. The social order had been inverted. The cattle had slaughtered the ranchers, and the community of masters was left to wonder whose plantation would be next. The story of the Christmas massacre spread faster than fire through Cain. For the white planters, it was a horror story, a confirmation of their deepest fears. For the enslaved, who heard the news in whispers passed from field to field, it was something else entirely. It was a prayer answered. The name Dinah traveled on the wind, a single word that meant everything. It meant that chains could be broken. It meant that masters could die. It meant that justice, however brutal, was possible. The community of the enslaved was being redefined not by geography, but by a shared, electrifying new idea of possibility. Dinah's act of vengeance didn't end with the fall of the Carter house. That was merely the first chapter. Her legacy, forged in that fire, now began its haunting, bloody journey across the South. The group of 247 fugitives, too large to remain hidden, eventually split. Either took the elders and the very young on a perilous journey east, toward a network of safe houses and free communities. But many stayed. They had not been freed merely to run. They had been freed to fight, under the leadership of Dinah, Jonas, and Mungo. A new entity was formed, a guerrilla army of former slaves who called themselves the Rememberers. Their war was not one of territory or politics. It was a war on memory itself, a mission to burn their stolen history into the minds of their oppressors. They struck with the swift, brutal precision Dinah had demonstrated. Their second target was a small estate called Fairmont, whose master was known for his particular cruelty. They entered before dawn and left by morning, the house burning, the chains broken, and 6 more people freed, carved into the door. A new message. This isn't over. A week later, they hit a plantation called Red Hollow, owned by a family known for branding runaways on the face. This time, there was a fight. One of their own, a boy of 16, was killed. Witnesses from that night would later claim that something broke in Dinah. She stormed the house alone, took 3 bullets that miraculously did not stop her, and killed 7 men by herself. When she walked out, soaked in blood, dragging the patriarch behind her, the others no longer saw a woman. They saw a divine instrument of wrath. Mungo said she was no longer flesh, but what comes after the scream. The authorities, panicking, finally responded. Official records state that in the spring of 1855, a Major William Hadley was dispatched from Washington with 130 mounted soldiers to crush the rebellion. They were armed with modern rifles and an unshakable arrogance. They entered the swamp at sunrise, confident of a swift victory. They were not prepared for a war against the land itself. The swamp, which had been Dinah's prison, was now her greatest ally. Hadley's men found their maps useless. Their guides vanished. Spikes hidden in shallow water crippled their horses. At night, they were tormented by the low, constant beat of drums that seemed to come from beneath the mud, and by whispers that flickered at the edge of their hearing. They were surrounded not by an army, but by a suffocating, intelligent silence. When they finally fired on a figure they saw in the mist, the figure did not fall, but simply vanished. On the fourth day, they found a symbol carved into a tree, a woman with no mouth, holding a child made of fire. The message beneath it read, "We are what you tried to bury." After 6 days, with half his men gone to disease, to traps, to madness, Hadley ordered a retreat. The official report was buried, but Hadley's private testimony survived. "She is not a woman," he wrote. "She is what we have made. She is every scream we ignored. And now she remembers." The greatest lingering secret is that of Dinah's own fate. Her war continued for the better part of a year, a phantom menace that left a trail of burning plantations and broken masters. But such a fire cannot burn forever. Her final battle, according to the legend, took place at a plantation called Cane Hollow, rebuilt by a Carter cousin who had sworn to capture her. In the ensuing fight, a small band of fighters was overwhelmed. Jonas fell, Mungo was captured, and Dinah, wounded and cornered, faced the soldiers alone in an open field. As they raised their rifles, a bolt of lightning, it is said, struck a nearby tree, and the dry field erupted in an unnatural, explosive fire. The soldiers fled in terror. When they returned, all they found was the axe, its head half melted, embedded in the scorched earth like a strange, metallic tombstone. Her body was never found. Some say she was consumed by the flames, her body finally rejoining the land she had weaponized. But others say she simply walked out of the fire, scorched but alive, and that she keeps walking still, a silent, avenging spirit moving through the deepest corners of the American South, a ghost born of a history that refuses to die. What then is the final meaning of Dinah Carter? She is a figure who defies easy categorization. Was she a hero or a monster, a liberator or a mass murderer? The answer depends entirely on which side of the whip you stood. To the world of the masters, her legacy was one of pure terror. For decades after, the name Dinah became a whispered boogeyman, a story told to frighten children and to remind planters of their own vulnerability. Christmas, for a generation of slave owners in Louisiana, was no longer a time of joyful celebration, but a time of quiet anxiety, of listening to the wind and barring the doors a little tighter. She became a dark goddess of retribution, a permanent fixture in the architecture of their nightmares. Her promise, written in the blood of the Carters, was that they would never ever sleep easy again. But for the millions who were held in bondage, and for their descendants, her legacy is something entirely different. Her name became a prayer, a symbol of ultimate resistance, a testament to the fact that even the most oppressed soul holds within it a spark that can, under the right and terrible pressure, ignite an inferno. They called her Mother Axe. Deliverance, the fire that woke the bones. She was a brutal answer to a brutal question. She demonstrated that when a system denies you justice, you are forced to create your own. Her story forces us to confront an uncomfortable and profound philosophical truth that the absence of justice does not create peace. It creates a vacuum. And into that vacuum, something will always rush. Sometimes it is hope. Sometimes it is despair. And sometimes it is a silent woman with an axe, ready to collect on a debt that has been left unpaid for far too long. The story of Dinah Carter is not a myth. It is a warning. It is the enduring historical evidence that memory can be a weapon, that silence can find a voice, and that no injustice can be buried so deep that it will not, one day, rise again. She was never a legend. She was an answer, and the question she answered is one that history, to this day, continues to ask.